especially with Christine High Risk.
All right. Oh, hello.
Oh. Okay, well, I think we can probably get started, especially for those watching the live stream. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Avonlea. I'm the festival administrator and incoming festival director for VERSeFest. I'm thrilled to be here to introduce this event. It's one of my favorite events, probably consistently every year, the Factory Lecture Series, just to have a little bit of diversity in the lineup and switch things up from poetry readings to talking about poetry. So VERSeFest, as you probably know, is running throughout all this week. All of our events to date are still available to go back and watch on our website. And all of our events this weekend are going to be live streamed there and available to go back and revisit after the fact. So thank you again all for being here. I hope that you check out the rest of our events throughout today and tomorrow. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Rob McLennan, who is going to be our host for the event. Take it away, Rob.
Thank you, Avonlea. Hello. Oh gosh, the host has spotlighted my video for everyone. Welcome to the 11th annual-ish Factory Lecture Series, an event that is an extension of the Factory Reading Series, a series I've lovingly hosted and curated since January 1993. So does that mean that my event is older than my two performers today? That's good.
Than me.
For each talk, solicited poets are asked months in advance to present an informal lecture on any topic concerning writing, ranging from their own practice, a particular favorite author, or subject to more wide-ranging ideas of the craft. Our first performer this afternoon is Amish Trivedi. He's the author of 3 books and numerous chapbooks, including a handful of titles from Above Ground Press. And his third full-length title is a newly published Future Panic, which I'm very excited about. It's apparently out, but I've not seen it. He has poems in American Poetry Review, Kenyon, Conjunctions, and other places. He has an MFA from Brown University and a PhD from Illinois State University. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Delaware and lives on the Maryland-Delaware border. Our second performer is Khashayar Mohammadi, a queer Iranian-born Toronto-based poet, writer, and translator. They are the winner of the Vallum Poetry Prize 2021 and author of 4 poetry chapbooks. Their debut poetry collection, Me, You, Then Snow, is out with Gordon Hill Press. And I will leave it to you now, Amish. It's your turn.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Everyone's good?
Yep.
I realize I can only see Rob's face now. So, and now my face, which is much worse. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I was really looking forward. We were just talking before you came in, Rob, that I was really looking forward to coming and meeting you finally in person. But I guess we'll put it off another year and let the anticipation and excitement build. So thanks. I didn't really come up with a title for my talk. I have on my notes here, worth it, ? On writing under techno-feudalism. We'll see if that really holds up as to what the talk is about, but yes. Anywho, so thank you again for the invites, and all right. I had my students who were mostly in their first semester of the university experience turn in a paper on their field, what they might want to study, what they might want to do career-wise. Most of them panicked. I assured them that they were not marrying this assignment, that there was no obligation here other than to do the broader project that they were working on. One student in the initial assignment of the project, a proposal, turned it in with the title Pharmaceutical Representative. They did all the work wonderfully, citations and all that boring stuff we look for, so no problem there, but I spent a good 15 minutes thinking, who the hell actually wants to be a pharmaceutical representative? I would have settled for astronaut or Olympian or president, a job that was really nearly destroyed in south of the border here this last year. But somehow I've dwelt now for some weeks on the idea that anyone, much less one of my students, would want to work for pharmaceutical companies pushing drugs on doctors, reproducing all the worst habits of capitalism in one of the most crucial places in our lives. But in the most disturbing way, I began to wonder to myself, does anyone set out to be a poet? Does anyone choose poetry as some kind of career? What does it mean to have a career in the field of poetry? Very few of us manage to do it in the wonderful way that Rob has done it, giving himself entirely to the renegade production of materials that exist within our field, journals, chapbooks, etc., as well as being a writer. For a lot of us, as Mark McGurl is quick to remind, higher education has become our refuge from the outside world, completely absorbing the field of poetry within it. Of course, we don't like this idea. We are, after all, necessarily opposed to that kind of patronage system that grew up around the program era, necessarily opposed to the systems of capital that require these kinds of survival mechanisms. And yet, of course, we're pretty happy to have some kind of support, some kind of money and funding come our way, naturally. Of course, it never really occurred to me to be a poet, but I was writing poems. I imagine, like anyone who starts writing as a teen, but of course it was just something to do. It was a way of dealing with whatever thoughts and ideas were coming along, and it took further engagement, as it does with most things, to actually work further. This meant reading that stellar high school canon that comes along, and I think most students, for most students, poetry becomes a difficulty, an I don't get it situation, or even worse, a situation in which teachers end up turning poems into puzzles, into some kind of riddle that must be solved. This is no doubt the outcome of an education system which teaches us to look for value in what we can define easily, to define things as worth it. There has to be some kind of payoff. I think any poet worth their salt must be rolling their eyes at this idea, the riddle that needs solving, the aha moment being the only reason the poet writes anything at all. I don't think for most of us that we get into writing to do this kind of work, to play some kind of game. But what is it that draws us to writing? Pierre Bourdieu, of whom I'm a fairly devout follower when I'm wearing my theory hat, would want me to say something here about class distinction and how we are charged by our habitus and by cultural capital to value not only the product that is the poem, but the very labor that goes into producing the poem, journal, book, whatever. We are, as it turns out, sort of predisposed by a number of factors into valuing what the poet or any other artist contributes to the society we're living in. As you may have guessed, I'm going to agree to say that most of us has some kind of class distinction which draws us to this field and makes it an acceptable career choice. No doubt many listening along will say, not me, Amish, but I have no doubt were we to dig just a little in on a one-on-one discussion, we would find out why you value the work of the poet and the object that is the poem. As far as the personal journey is concerned, it never occurred to me to actually become a poet. It wasn't a career. It was something that people in the before times did when we, even though I didn't have the language then, lived free of the whims of the modern post-Fordist capitalism in which we are defined by our production, defined by the profits we generate for others. Everything under neoliberalism is defined by value. The question, is this worth doing? Poetry, if you're not already predisposed due to a number of factors, rarely becomes worth doing, rarely becomes a thing one finds value in. It is the struggle we have in finding new venues, in growing our field for readers. This is not the case for other arts, for all other arts, I should say, which have in their own ways been absorbed not by the grand estate that is the 20th century university system, but rather by the Fordist and post-Fordist political economy. So much of production has moved into actual, films are made by companies, for example. They're defined by their value, define themselves as generating profit for corporations, define themselves as worth it. So poetry did, I feel like I can certainly say at this point, find itself absorbed by the university system of the late 19th century and early 20th. Keep in mind that universities, both American and Canadian, as well as a number of European universities, I won't speculate further since I'm not an expert beyond my own backyard, found themselves influenced by the Humboldtian model in which the university should find itself at the center of a community, at the center of the cultural production, discussion, and evaluation that was going on in a society. Universities in their missions at the end of the 19th century wanted to be that center of culture, and this meant absorbing as much as possible of late 19th century world, of the late 19th century world into its walls, especially all forms of cultural production. As such, the art life slowly morphed for many into the academic life, no doubt because the university provided, as already described by McGurl, a true patronage system. Give us your production, we'll give you jobs, money, teach you a few skills. You can teach, you can work in publishing. There's also free coffee, office space, and hopefully some cheap labor in the name of students. We'll fund your journals and your books and your reading series. Whatever other little ventures you can come up with, we'll write you a check. The university of the late 19th and early 20th century wanted to be a one-stop shop for culture. In some ways, we're still holding on to this, hoping this model that is not yet 150 years old will endure. The thing about centers is that they never end up holding. And this is where we are now and have been for the last 50 years of neoliberal policies that have crimped the university and made it, certainly in the US and I suspect increasingly elsewhere, into a minor league system for businesses and industry. I apologize for not knowing what the hockey equivalent is for minor leagues, but you'll understand my meaning, a system which feeds into the larger machine. And in this case, one that is primarily publicly funded by a public that no longer understands the value of the education as it exists separately from careers and positions. The mission of the university, as the late Bill Reddings writes at length, is in ruins around us. What will follow is really anyone's guess, but I think to an extent it's things like this, independently run festivals and organizations that no longer require the old systems to support them, though no doubt some forms of support will always be required. And people like Rob who are doing things on their own the way that they want. I think too we'll see the rise of things like Frequency in Providence, Rhode Island, an independent organization which runs workshops and readings and does many of the things we expected university centers to do, but without the administrative terror that is the modern university setting. They do it on their own with a small board of directors and instructors that they hire on an individual basis, charging people for coming to workshops, etc. There are, as ever, people who would want to write and discuss their own work, and I suspect we'll see more of that moving away from credentialized creative writing programs. For me, I'm always kind of writing in ruins. Future Panic is about a collective ruins, the graveyard earth we're living on. Eventually an object that will itself cease to be, scattered in space or melted and nothing but gases and particulates. Writing to me has become the mechanism by which to begin thinking about the world, our society, our culture, the collective one, not one defined by national borders or any other kind of divisions we've drawn around ourselves. In a sense, I think I have come to finally understand that the act of writing itself, that every act in my own life is about community. The group or groups within our sphere, shaped by our various interests, our recognition of and mutual understanding of forms of capital, even if we don't openly acknowledge it or even necessarily understand it. It is this mutual understanding of our labor and our production that helps us form writing communities or reading communities. What folks in rhetoric would probably prefer I call a discourse community. I see my writing, my work as writer, as educator, reviewer, whatever, as part of an engagement with all of you, with all of us. In a way, I think this is where this last book, Future Panic, started. I remember reading an interview with Sting as a police-obsessed teenager that you eventually start to move beyond immediate concerns for the self. And I found myself in 2014 or so starting to become incredibly concerned, as I suppose all aging people do, about the young people in my classes. There was a kind of pervasive nihilism among my students that I'm not sure I had felt or that I had necessarily recognized among my peers. Of course, I am nothing if not an expert in a kind of cynical nihilism, but I was disturbed to hear this from young people who had more or less the most comfortable lives that I could imagine. Upper middle class upbringings, cozy New England college without the pressure of the bigger New England schools, wealth, material. What was there to feel an impending sense of doom about? And I got to thinking and I got to writing. And in writing, I realized that it is impossible now. I like to think probably made more impossible after 2016, to feel as though no matter how good or how bad one might have things, the world is collapsing around our ears, to quote REM's radio song. Climate, politics, there seem to be forces hell-bent on murder and destruction in the name of profit, a pervasive feeling not just for classic left-leaning folks, but rather for everyone now. We're all hyper-aware every day that ways in which our various systems are failing us, and not merely on a nation-to-nation basis, but globally speaking. And it's not just, as the admonition goes, a bunch of people who have too much time on their hands. Enter a diner near you, and the discussion among staff is about the questions of labor and their relationship to management. They don't necessarily have the language, especially because we're taught, at least on this side of the border, that language itself is very dangerous. But they know something is not right. Things are not going as they should be. And yet we seem trapped, aware of what needs doing, but still just comfortable and happy enough to not do anything about it. Why ruin the system we have for the system we cannot even imagine? We talk of revolution, and the harder truth is what happens the next day when everyone wants to wake up from a long, restful night of sleep and just get back to normal. Here, future panic turns not inwards towards some kind of spiritual awakening, but recognizes in some ways that our historical way of managing these existential crises as a society has been to start thinking outward, out beyond, over the horizon, out beyond the moon, and into various galactic spaces. Our salvation as humans, we rather foolishly believe, exists at the far end of our fingers, just out of our grasp, and that the best way to reach it is to physically go somewhere. Somewhere in here, I began reading about the Earth's eventual end through the expansion of the sun and all sorts of horrible things like that. Death is scary enough for us as humans, but what's really scary is the realization that unless we are very wrong about the nature of the universe and its distances, no one will ever know we were here. All the experiences will mean absolutely nothing because we will no longer have any kind of oral history to pass or ears to pass them along to. Here I started reading about John von Neumann, who before we even left the atmosphere of the Earth, theorized the building of machines that could travel across the galaxy in a mere 4 million years, landing on distant planets and absorbing the resources required to rebuild themselves and send themselves on to the next place. They were called universal replicators, half mechanical tool, half biological machine that could do all the work for this travel on its own. But then this is where the dread set in. Who was this for? Who would such a machine even benefit, assuming anyone at the far end even existed, answering and reaching back out? Maybe if I was asking if such an endeavor was worth it, and worth it to whom? So this is where future panic kind of begins, and the writing process can do, for me as a person experiencing all these same anxieties of being, is become the place in which I begin to work through these anxieties and those feelings. Future panic is not, in that way, felt like one of those novels too big to really describe. I cannot say what it's about because in a way it's about everything, all of time happening at once. We're experiencing every moment of it, not in a relativistic way, but rather as it occurs. Our current panics are already happening and already have happened and will happen. and will have happened too. I was reading a few weeks back with the poet Madison MacArthur, who would no doubt be a great ask for next year's festival, I'll say. And he wrote me after to say how amazed he was at how well Future Panic functioned both as poetry book, but as a kind of radical manifesto. I had not considered it as such, but I also thought, well, of course it is. What else is writing but always pushing those ideas that are most central to who we are, to the way we envision the world? I always see writing as a kind of invention, as a calling into being of an idealized world, the way we want to live, the way we want to see ourselves in it. I've spent some time here considering the way that the system of higher education has spent much of the 20th century and into the 21st century in support of art production. But as that starts to fall away, I fear we're turning more towards a space no one quite understands yet. I kind of take that back. Some people understand it very well. It is corporate, it is nebulous, existing beyond brick and mortar places and beyond any particular discourse community, creating a whole new one based on its various platforms. Social media has become, in a very quick amount of time relative to the entire human experience on Earth, the place through which all things must go. If it doesn't exist in social media, it may as well not exist at all. Social media has become an interesting point in a discussion of value in the current political economy, which lends itself to impressions of a kind of anarchist space in which there is no authority or gatekeeping to be done. Of course, this is pure delusion. Social media is not free of these mechanisms any more than any other space is, space in which we do our reading and writing, but we're still trying to figure it out. In some ways, I think Future Panic grew out of an anxiety about that space too, because we had not imagined it in some ways as humans. We can talk about the anxieties of space or climate or government, but we had not really properly imagined what spaces like social media platforms would create, further complicating the question of worth and value. As a poet whose day gig is teaching and who wears a few hats as writer, I do wonder now more than before about the way in which that writing exists in this hard to define space, harder even still to theorize because it is filled with unknowns. I like to think that that next works, whether in the poetry realm or theoretical realm, will begin to ask how poetry, the ancient art, begins to reconcile these spaces and how it begins to function under new and emergent political economies. As Yanis Varoufakis, the former economic minister of Greece, puts it, we've moved beyond this post-Fordism of the last 50, 60 years, and maybe are even moving out of a period of capitalism into a techno-feudalism, driven more by platforms than even by nation states. Which I suspect will be something of a relic even within our lifetimes, existing more to provide transnational corporations with resources than having anything to do with our daily lives. How do we write from this space? And perhaps more importantly, what can the art of writing still do? What can poetry do to call into question these power dynamics? I know that these will be questions that I'm going to be working on going forward. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much. Okay, and now we're going to go to Cass. Are you ready?
Well, I think I have answers for those. Wait, was my mic on? Oh my God. Were people hearing noises from while you were speaking? I'm sorry. Anyway, so I guess I have some answers to those. And based on, so I wrote a certain, something for today. And last night I couldn't sleep because of the whole Kyle Rittenhouse, it was just such a pile of, such a cherry on top of a shit-filled cake that was everything that happened in the past week. And, I couldn't sleep until about like 5 a.m. So I basically rewrote 80% of everything that I wanted to do in a very improvised manner. And based on everything you say, I'm gonna improvise the last 10% because I think I have I'm not saying answers, but I think I have responses to your to everything that you said. So I want to talk about my 3 major interactions. Sorry, let me just put a timer here. So I just want to talk about 3 major interactions that I had with poetry. Well, first of all, welcome. What up? And I just want to say how I came into writing and, my first encounters with writing. Well, I grew up in a family with a lot of writers. Actually, not a lot of writers. I grew up in an incredibly overtly aggressive translator family. Like my 7 uncles translated from 11 different languages. And I grew up around a lot of writing. And as weird as it is, considering me being Persian, in Iran, you really can't escape poetry. And I think in that way, it is quite an individual experience. I think in North America, you can spend your entire life, having never heard a full poem. But I think in Iran, it is in the psyche of the average person because our grandparents were basically taught nothing other than poetry. Our great-grandparents, our grandparents and great-grandparents, those who were educated, were sat in, little halls and taught different poets and the Quran. That's all they knew. They would be taught Sa'di for morality. They would be taught Ferdowsi for literature. They would be taught Hafiz for spirituality. And because of that, poetry has a much bigger working class root in Iran. Well, I'm not going to get into that so far, but the strange thing is that I grew up never getting into poetry, and that is, due to my family. My family wasn't into poetry. My family translated all prose. But aside from me writing for, the school's Insha class, which is just, a creative essay writing class that all Iranians have to do, I remember the first time I wrote not out of solicitation, not out of, any external need, but out of an internal need. And I remember this very clearly because I was 14 and, in a teenage afternoon little frolic, we went to the mall next to our school, and in a teenage impulse, my friend turned off the escalator. So the bells ring and 2 security guards twist our arms behind our backs and basically parade us around the ground floor before taking us into the security office. And I just want to make sure to tell you that this happened in Iran. So this is not a story of racial profiling or anything of the like. This is just a story of power politics. And they held us for about 3.5 to 4 hours, just speaking down to us. And I remember getting out of that place. I remember getting home, and no matter what I did, I had a lot of avenues for expression. I had, my paint, I would paint, I would make illustrations, I would play games. None of these helped anymore. And I remember as a kid, I always, whenever I felt bored, whenever I felt lonely, I would take up a piece of paper and, do something with it. Draw lines, write, whatever. So I take up a notebook and I start writing. And in writing, I begin to somewhat undo what had happened to me during that day. So this is 14-year-old me doing this basically out of catharsis, out of, not knowing what else to do. And in my mid-20s, I realized, this is something that psychiatrists, counselors, therapists get their, patients to do in order to actually gain power in their history, in their trauma. I'm not going to call that trauma. It was certainly a disproportionate response to something that was, stupid at best. But that happened, and I basically, being 14, forgot about it immediately. I did that, got over it, got over my anger that could not go away. And when it went away, I took no lessons. So it all goes away until the next encounter with poetry, which is when I am 19 and I have my first heartbreak. And I know that in the greater context of things, calling a 19-year-old's first heartbreak grief is an overstatement. But I think in a teenager's vocabulary, a first heartbreak might perhaps be the greatest grief that you have experienced thus far. So I'm gonna contextualize that as undoing my grief, because when you move past the more you move past your teens, the more you think that was stupid. But when you're in that time and place, when you lose your first love, when you lose that first glimmer of hope, that is quite the cacophony in your head. So I took up writing. I wrote my first poem, and I performed my first poem. And this time, being a little bit older, it did something to me. I realized it's healing. So I became quite addicted to it. So here I want to speak about two different ways that people come into writing, which is that there are people like me who come into writing from a sort of impulse, immediacy, urgency, and necessity. And there are people who come to, I want to overgeneralize and say there are people who come to it later, but that's not necessarily the case. But there are people who come to it willingly from the start and in control. And I really want to discuss this whole impulse versus control aspect of writing. I remember there's a very famous keynote speech by John Cleese of the Monty Python fame, when he talks about modes of creativity, and he talks about this very thing, about modes of impulse and modes of control, how you get your best ideas in modes of impulse, but in the mode of impulse, you can never make a polished work. So you have to turn that off or come back to work in a mode of control and polish it into what it is. So some people come to writing from this mode of impulse, and as you develop, as you write more, you gain technical knowledge, you gain a lot of different types of knowledge. Again, I'm in no way came to this from academia. Everything I learned from listening to people I liked and performing and realizing what didn't work. And the more you realize what works, the more you will start to carve a little audience for yourself. And the more you carve a little audience for yourself, the more you begin this whole trajectory of, perhaps this is not always the case, but the more you carve a nebulous audience and you find a certain thing works for you, the more you perhaps chase that and get away from your form of impulse. And you get to a point where your success has taken you away from that, teenage being on your belly, writing on your little notebook with like a little pen. It takes you away from that. And I remember listening to Noel Fielding on Mark Maron, and Noel Fielding is one of my favorite comedians, and he was talking about writing some of his favorite TV shows, and he's like, what, I spent so much time trying to recapture the alchemy of just being a teenager and writing for the hell of it. And I think a lot of us end up really striving for that urgency that we find hard to recapture later on. So as in a very, I would say, in my personal trajectory and in a lot of trajectories that I have seen around me, the more you learn, the more systematically you begin to write. So as opposed to, you start beginning to write in a way that's very far from what you began to write for. You first began writing because you couldn't get through the night if you didn't. And then a few years in, you might be like, oh, this is a Friday night. I've had my tea. I've had my dinner. Why don't I write a poem? Oh, perhaps about this thing I was thinking of 3 days ago. You know, it's, again, this is not a value judgment, but it's something that is incredibly different from how I began coming into writing. So how does this, fit with white supremacy, racial violence? Well, Amish was talking about the poet against capital. And I think if there's one thing that the pandemic has done to us is prove how we are essential to undoing global grief, while at the same time simultaneously proving to us that we are useless to capital. And I don't know how else to put this, but I think for a lot of us, we had this little glimmer of hope that perhaps in the worst of cases, there would be some help. Perhaps when things get as worse as it gets, and I know this comes from a place of privilege, because a lot of people have been, experiencing the worst for decades, but there's quite something to being proven you are worthless to capital, that after literal years of people dying endlessly, people being beaten up by the police, people's land being invaded still again, homeless people in an endless cycle of being picked up and abandoned at the arms of the city. I think pandemic was very crucial in proving our worthlessness to capital. So I want to talk about my third encounter with writing. This summer, when the Sheikh Jarrah happened in Palestine, well, it was a lot of, it was shit wall to wall. Why, every day, like, there was police brutality, indigenous brutality, climate change. And Sheikh Jarrah, and specifically the burning of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was the straw that broke the camel's back, where I just couldn't come to terms with myself. I couldn't sleep. And from all this grief that existed in my body, I just couldn't sleep. So, I just began thinking of it. Sheikh Jarrah, racial profiling, climate change, disability rights, queer bashing, deaths in the family. Well, that was a thing as well. People dying from my family from COVID. That was all in my body, and it was looking for a crevice. So I sat down to heal. I sat down on my balcony, and I decided I was not going to leave until I had come to terms with, at least something in my body. I sat down on my balcony and I said, with a piece of paper, and I said, I am sitting here until the sun comes up. I'm going to listen to my body. I'm going to listen to the wind. I'm going to write not to, basically to undo some grief, perhaps for the third time. As we go forward, the definition of grief gets increasingly more complex. The first time Sorry, am I still okay? So the first time it was, just a harsh encounter. Second time, heartbreak. Third time, global grief, But what happened is what happens when you're patient with your body. Your body tells you exactly what it needs. And I sat there until the sun came up, and it was surprisingly a lot easier than I thought it would be. I sat there listening to myself, closed eyes, the wind. I sat there, and every half an hour, I would write a word or 2 or 10. And I sat there realizing that there is something, I find something, I realized that I'm looking at healing from the wrong perspective. And this is somewhere that I'm gonna improvise a little bit, because you were talking about the absolute horror of, okay, well, this will continue our, I'm talking to Amish, of course, and their speech about how this will continue human life, but disconnected from all the human life we know. So who is that for? Well, it is something that comes back to me every time. I have a huge interest in cosmic horror, but I also read a lot of Sufi writing, and I keep seeing this interesting overlap between the two, that they are the same 90% of the way, of people who are incredibly existentially volatile at the very end of their wits. And the story is the same all the way. It's just the scope is different. So in Sufism, it is proven, when both stories end with the same punchline, that a person's significance in the grand scheme of things, of the cosmos, is proven to be absolute zero. That a person, in the end of Sufism and at the end of cosmic horror, the logical conclusion of both becomes that the person dissolves into the absolute. And while Sufism considers that the holiest of human experiences, cosmic horror presents that as the greatest horror a human being can undergo. And it all comes back to the scope at which we consider the individual. Well, if we consider the self as a contained singularity, then the solution is horror. If we consider the self as a continuation of something massive, it is something beautiful. But what does that do to agency? So my third act of healing, my third encounter with writing, I think what I took away from it was that self-care in its individualist Western escapism is not what I aspire to. One needs to tend to oneself and one needs to take care of oneself, but I refuse to consider sensory overload in order to avoid the community and act of self-care. I think healing ourselves should come not before or not separate from, but as a byproduct of healing our communities. And in writing, such a radical act of healing and such a radical act of empathizing and sympathizing, that can be done. And well, writing is a radical act. With our writing, we can do and undo so much grief in this world. I personally will not stand for anyone who considers writing inessential, because at 3 times in my life where nothing else could console me, the act of writing, the act of reading, the act of engaging with discourse saved my life. I think that's it.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you both. Amish, do you have a response to his talk?
Yeah, my immediate first thought is this is where my much of my theoretical stuff falls apart, is I cannot account in some ways for spiritual aspects because I don't feel those things. I don't believe this. So I'm immediately in awe of anyone that can end up sort of leaning into that, because I can't. And so there's always this kind of, it's not even a sense of, it's almost just wonder that, like, I wish that were something I felt, because I do think that would answer a lot of the anxiety for me, a lot of those sort of bigger concerns, that, like, it's in some ways, I condemned myself in some ways to only being cynical because I haven't given myself any kind of out from it. So that's my immediate feeling. Otherwise, a great talk. I love the way that you framed it in terms of times that you came back to it, and the ways in which different forms of grief can bring us into the space of writing. That was really stellar. That was great.
Yeah. Oh my Lord, I'm very impressed with both of you, and I put it in the chat, but I'll remind those people out there listening, if you have a question for either of these two, or around the talk, not like financial questions or anything like that, please put them in the chat.
We're here to provide any kind of counseling.
Why are you speaking on behalf of us? We're here. We're all about accounting.
Are you?
Yeah.
I'm not here for the math myself. If you were willing to offer financial advice, investing, I like how you both seem to, in your own way, try to talk about, like, the function of the poem, or the function of writing, or the function of the poet. I found that really fascinating, the two of you coming to that from different directions. And Amish, you talked about, like, the label of poet. Kes, what do you think of that? Like, I don't call myself a poet. I kind of cringe at the term, in part because it feels reductive, because anyone who's going to refer to me as that is usually someone who's not interested in poetry. So it becomes like Western culture has kind of turned that into almost a derogatory term. And then for myself personally, I consider it to be only a fraction of what I do. So it seems a reductive term in that. I like writer. It encompasses a bunch. But what do you think of the term? Do you call yourself a poet?
I think I always do poet, writer, translator. I think I always do all three, because right. I don't know. I think, I've every time I've put it somewhere, I've always been like poet, writer, translator. I don't know. I think I call myself a poet because I personally think 95% of everything I do is read, write, discuss, review poetry.
Right.
So but I know that you do a lot more things, so I understand why you wouldn't like to say poetry, but I think
this is not all I do, right? If I'm going to define myself by what I spend the bulk of my time doing, it's sleeper or television watcher. And no one wants to hear about either of those things.
Yeah. The professional perspirator.
Yeah, maybe. I want to boil it down to just Rob makes stuff that's just way less complicated than anything else.
It's funny, like the more you move forward like at the proverbial you. The more you move forward, the less the shorter you want your bio to become. You're like, I don't want to I don't want to talk about everything I've done. I just say this is a person coming, you know.
Yeah.
That is really true. Yeah, I have found myself, I've been writing a lot of bios lately. I just want to be like, Amish Trivedi is, I'm just kind of here, I'm hanging out, it's cool. You know, yeah, it's weird. You don't want to, like, you start to like find ways, and I think I see Rob's problem is like it becomes a way in which to dismiss. And I think it took me a long time to really come back to it as a title, as something that I wanted to call myself and something that I wanted to actively be considered. You know, I think especially like in the last 2 years for me, where I got away, like I finished up PhD things, and I could have done a moment in which I felt like I could have done anything with the rest of my life. It was like, this is still the thing I'm obsessed with. This is still the thing I love. I mean, if there were a job just watching TV, you're right, that would be great. But there's not. So, you know, it really took some time to actually come back to wanting to call myself that. And anyone who is going to be dismissive of that, like, let them. That's fine. You know, who needs them?
True, but I also came from a farming community, so anyone calling themselves poet is not necessarily, that's not a compliment.
We can't rely on Rob for anything. All right. Well,
yeah, that's pretty much what it means. Yeah. So you're not going to help then, you know.
Fair.
I keep hoping that someone in the chat will actually ask some questions for either of you. I think it's very cool, Cassie, you came from a family background of translators. That just sounds really neat.
Yeah. Well, it was unfortunate because of the 7 uncles, 2 fled for political reasons, 3 died in 4 died in 2 separate horrible car crashes.
Oh, wow.
And only 1 was left for me, like, to interact with, like, growing up. So, I mean, that family background is always there, but like the first 10 years of my life was just death and political, you know, like it was a lot of jailing, a lot of torture, and a lot of, you know, fleeing.
Right.
So I never got to like interact with them much. I have only just connected with one of them and sent one of my books. But yeah, it actually, like my uncle, one of my uncles who died just before I was born, his translations of Pablo Neruda are still the go-to translations in Iran. It's like in the 35th or 36th edition for over like 35 years in Iran.
Wow.
That is very cool.
Yeah,
that's very cool.
And then, so did that impact your consideration for translation?
Well, yeah, I don't think I've ever looked at writing apart from translation, really. I don't know. I think like as when you come to writing from a different language, you sort of begin at translation, no matter what. Like, you know, when you first start writing in your second language or third language, you start, you know, oh my God, someone just dropped a 2-hour. Oh my God. How much time do you have? How much time do you have for me to respond to Coleman Barks? That's a 2-hour question. Sorry. Anyway.
I think we got to be done by 2:15.
Yeah. So, okay.
We got some time.
Well, actually, I did a whole event on Coleman Barks, and you know, first of all, I gotta admit, Coleman Barks's Essential Rumi has improved throughout the years, which is weird. Like, how can you So like the original book was basically like, I don't know, like I'm not making this as any value judgment, but it was kind of like, I don't, if you have ever read Rupi Kaur, like that kind of writing, if you imagine like that Instagram style, 2-3 words, 2-3 words, space, 2-3 words. That was initially what Coleman Barks' Essential Rumi was. And I read that, and as someone who comes from like an Iranian background, you know, Rumi has about 4,600 ghazals, which are, you know, between 8 to 12 lines. And then he has his Masnavi, which is, you know, poems that are between 20 to like hundreds and hundreds of lines long. And then he has Fiha Mafi, which is a difficult and dense philosophical text. So he has nothing in his oeuvre along the lines of what you see in Coleman Barks. And Coleman Barks defines that he had a spiritual relationship with Rumi and had a breakthrough. And well, there has been a lot of talk about that. Well, if you had a breakthrough, if you had like a spiritual encounter, do what a lot of people do, which is write poetry based on what has moved you, as opposed to you translating from a language that you do not know. There's the same problem with the book The Gift, which is apparently which is supposed translations of Hafiz, which Hafiz scholars have mentioned many times that it does not, you know, match. Also, like, I don't know if any of you are interested, I have just done a book of ghazal translations. There's a Rumi ghazal in there, there's a Hafiz ghazal in there, and I actually linked it here. It's the one that's Answer Their Press. I'll just link it again. And anyway, yeah, Coleman Barks has made it impossible for, because his book, I don't know if it's still the case, but his book used to be the Essential Rumi used to be the most sold poetry book worldwide until it was overtaken by Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur. And I think a lot of criticisms of Rupi Kaur falls into a very misogynistic way, but just think of it in the way that these, like, just put it into your mind that the very fact that these two books are competing says something about the quality of the translation, because Rumi is incredibly dense, and the people who elaborate on Rumi in Iran are people who have studied him for 30 years, which is an elitism of its own. I'm not going to get into it. Anyway, that's it.
So if Coleman Bark was offering his own perspective, would we refer to that as a Rumi with a view?
Yeah, I guess so.
Thank you. Amish, did you want to respond aloud to that question from Kat? Did you want to speak to any of that?
Yeah, well, there's really nothing to disagree with in what Kat has to say. That, like, yeah, it's trapped in that transition between how do I take the only thing I'm kind of good at and support myself with it without selling my soul to shitty social media articles. Yeah, that's kind of the name of the game. It's, you have to play it in some ways, but at the same time, you know, I don't know anyone that really enjoys those spaces, do they? Like, I don't really know anyone, I think, that like really appreciates that it becomes the measure of ways in which things are doing well, in which objects are doing well. But I, of course, find myself, like, all this week, it's like, did anyone tweet about my book? Like, has anyone liked my post about, you know, this thing? It's like I have to stop, and it is awful. And I, as I said to Kat in text, it's a real struggle, and I think we're so newly into it. It seems like, oh, like 10 years of Twitter or whatever, or 20 years, not quite, of Facebook. Like, we should be pretty used to it. It's like, no, it's not a real amount of time at all. It's very short. And how we're beginning to interact in a new way, and I find myself at a complete loss and really hating myself most of the time for it. So yeah, I sort of keep telling myself, it's like, all right, as soon as book things are done, once we kind of can forget about it, I'm just quitting. Like, I'm just done. I gotta get out of this. And like any good addict, I know I really won't.
I try to like your things as much as I can. And
yes, you're the only, you and my mom. So
did you mail your mother a book?
No, they specifically told me not to. They were wanting to buy one. So, and then they ended up buying two, which was really nice of them. So.
That's very nice. Yeah. See, I know I've got a book forthcoming, which reminds me that I've never been on an anticipated list, but then I have to remind myself further that that has nothing to do with whether or not my book or work at all is anticipated or not.
Yeah.
But it's still irritating. I want someone to anticipate me publicly.
Oh my God.
I'll ask a question.
There you go, Brecken. Go ahead. Hi.
These talks were super great for me today, and I really appreciate the interplay between what it is to be a poet and what it is to encounter the world and politically. There's a lot I could say about social media as well, but maybe I'll just stick to the core of my question so I don't babble on and on. But like, I am interested in the intersection between being a writer and being an activist. So, we have our poetry, our writing to kind of speak back against these injustices. From the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict to climate catastrophe, with like the full range of human created disaster. And then there's also activist space, and then there's also like that kind of, the community of writing, the community of activism. So I'm just interested in each of you kind of reflecting on that for you as well, the intersection there.
Amish, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think in some ways it's I will start by saying that I think writing has made me more of an activist. Writing has made me more engaged, in part because I see myself as that is actually the way in which I'm active. That somebody has to be, not to put myself on any kind of weird pedestal, but like somebody's got to be generating ideas. So there has to be some point in a culture that like we have to start thinking and imagining. And I really do think that that's kind of where political activism begins for me. And then of course it branches out into actually doing things and going places and holding signs and that sort of thing. But I think so much of it really does stem from the act of writing is always kind of an act of subversion. That it is as Khashayar said, a kind of political act just to actually do it. And so that's kind of where that intersection is to me, because I think you're always kind of questioning in the act of writing any kind of status quo. You're always questioning just by the very act of adding words on paper. You're immediately questioning how power dynamics function. And I think that's always a little dangerous in a good way. And I think for me that's just really where so many things begin. And I don't know what the coming years on that front look like for me. But it does find me getting more and more engaged in other ways through just that big thing. And I think that's kind of where that definition of poet comes in. Like maybe that's a place from which one can actually be active politically and say that it's all right. Like instead of saying, oh yeah, well, in my case, well, that person's a useless member of society, rather to go the other way and say, no, I'm here to, throw a brick through a window. And that's becoming more my politics as well. So Yeah, probably kind of rambling at this point, but
also, I just want to say something very strange, which is that your name reminds me of one of my favorite German poems. It's a very short poem, so I'll say it all. It goes: Brot backen, Brot breken, Brot teilen, Brot sein. It means baking bread, breaking bread, sharing bread, being bread.
That's
anyway.
amazing. I haven't heard that before, and I love that so much.
That's great.
Also, thanks for the compliment on my earrings.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, that's a rainbow flag ice pack behind you on the.
Yeah, it is yes.
Anyway, so I'm gonna say something from like a very different perspective, which is that I find it very like, I think a way which a lot of Western communities, I think it's very clever to very openly award radical writing, because it very quickly kind of lose. Anyway, like I think it's strange, because I don't want to be the brown guy being like, oh, like North America is fucking evil, but hear me out, which is that, you know, there is something very evil about awarding the very behaviors that is trying to overthrow you, which very quickly undermines it. Like we see this over and over, that like the most radical writing is very quickly, like the ones that are like, I think the ones that are truly, you know, trying to make a difference, they get truly undermined by being very quickly absorbed into word culture and become very mainstream to a point of not mattering anymore. And it's, I don't know how to explain it better, but like, for example, like, you know, it's like, you know, the Oscars being like, oh, the Oscars goes to like this film that is trying to that is trying to explain how like the film industry is sexist. Hey, everyone just clap for this, and look, like the Academy is giving an award to this. You know what I mean? I don't know how to like give a candid response to that, but like I think it's a very clever way of undermining, because I come from a very distinct relationship to this, which is that I think in Iran, I'm very positive to say that poetry was not one of the only, but perhaps the most important part of the Iranian revolution. And poets were absolute legends in their poetry. Would be, you know, in like little pamphlets, like people like my mom would carry them under their under their chador. I don't know if you know what a chador is. It's a you know, veil, and carry it to places, and they would be read underground. And poetry was literally what sparked the people to create a revolution. It is an absolute fact. And after the revolution and during the like I think poetry, like political poetry in Iran, I personally think you cannot find poets who are not political activists in Iranian community, because poetry in Iran is, for at least 100 years, has been deeply interwoven with politics. But what I'm going to say is that it creates this other edge of the sword where there are people who will just write political poetry for clout, basically, and use this facade as political activists to perhaps, again, this is not a space like to discuss this in like 2 or 3 minutes. But as like my background, when I look at this, it is just insane how the interplay is insane, where in Iran, everyone who says anything societal is immediately like, there are more journalists and poets in jail than there are anything else. That's a true fact. That is an Amnesty International fact. I think in the 2011 upheavals, which is the reason I left Iran, I think 90% of like all muggers, killers, all of these people were let go just to make space for the journalists. That, you know, journalists, writers, poets. Anyway, I don't think there's any way for me to succinctly wrap this together, so I'm just going to leave it at here.
I just really appreciate that response, because I think that capitalism does like very effectively neutralize opposition, and through like it's very functioning, like through reward and capital.
Through
It
through its absorption. Yeah.
Well,
exactly. And so
it's
like it's an amazing idea that I think is very foreign to Western writing, to think that poets could be at the forefront of activism, like for their work. It doesn't mean that poets couldn't be at the forefront of activism, but I think like the poetry itself is not considered to be like that crux.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the Kirby effect, you know, like the capitalism will just subsume any subculture and make money off of it because it can, you know. And like it's very like it's very interesting, because this is something that I've seen after coming to North America, where you really very quickly realize that a lot of the oppressions have become consumer wishes. Like a lot of people's oppression are just consumer fulfillment. Anyway, that's it.
Amish, did you want to spend a minute and a half talking about Pearl's question about the crumbling of academia?
Yeah, happily. I'll see if I can condense it all into the 2 minutes of space. But basically, we're going to all end up working in call centers, right? So it's pretty easy. That's where we're all going to go. Is we're just going to all end up in call centers.
That's a dark place to leave this conversation.
Anyway, thank you.
I'll just say you can go and work for the government too, which is what I did.
Oh, that sounds really nice. Yeah,
you can work at a call center. You can work for the government. You could maybe go and work retail.
There used to be an old insurance company. I think they're still out there. It's like General, and their ad was always like, sooner or later you're going to own General, and it's like, yeah, like sooner or later you're going to end up one of those things. Yeah, I especially like crashing and burning. That does sound like the thing, but I think some ways we have to temper our expectations as well, like that it's not going to be the academic space of the mid 70s, that it's going to have to be a new space, but failing that, call centers and government work.
Again, that is a dark place to leave this conversation. Thank you both. This was great. Thank you, Brecken, for assisting from your kitchen. You should fix hole in your ceiling.
Yeah, oh my gosh, can you see the hole in my ceiling? And my 4-year-old's walking around like waving flashlights too, so it's really...
I'm supposed to remind people that at 2:30 there is the Inwards and Blue Mondays reading, hosted by Leslie Roach. There are 4 readers for that. Thank you, VERSeFest, Avonlea, Monty, etc., etc. And I think that is it.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you, Brecken, for your questions.
Thank you so much, both. Thanks,
Rob.
Kat.
Thanks, Pearl.
Have a good one.
Take care.